Okay, so the next speaker will be a bit challenged because now we're going down in time. I think it's about 15 minutes now. So why don't I ask Agnes to come up and join me? Professor Agnes Andersson Djurfeldt, team leader Afrint, Lund University. This morning, and also by David, academia comes up a lot as well as a key factor in these discussions. So you are representing Lund University here. We look very much forward to listen to you. Give her applause.
Yes, thank you. You can hear me? Yes, okay, good. I'm very delighted that David mentioned livelihoods and smallholders. So I'll sort of, I think, carry on that theme, which is much related to what I do for a living. And I'll be speaking on the topic of who is the African smallholder farmer. I will be posing, or hopefully not only posing, but also answering three key questions during this presentation. The first one is the basic descriptive question of who is the African smallholder, and why should we care? Is sort of the normative as well as the practical question that's tied to this description. And I think David actually answered much of this aspect of why should we care. So he saved me about 5 minutes, which I'm very grateful for. Yes. And then how has smallholder farming changed over the past decade, which of course is very closely related to the first question. And finally, how can African smallholders contribute to this vision of a zero hunger world? That will give me 5 minutes for that particular question, which is perhaps the more interesting one. And what I will be doing is I'll be departing from data that we have collected in a project that I had since 2007. The data has been, the project predates me, so it was initiated in 2002. And we have covered smallholders in six African countries. So far, I'll be presenting data from 5 of them because we just received the data from Mozambique on Friday. So I haven't had time to analyze that. But I'll be looking at trends in Ghana, Kenya, Malawi, Tanzania, and Zambia. And this data covers 14 regions across these countries. Roughly, in what I'll be presenting here covers roughly 2,000 households that were interviewed in 2002, then again in 2008, and finally during 2013 through 15. And in terms of where these sites are located, they've been purposely sampled in dynamic and less dynamic regions to give some idea of the prospects for agricultural growth and intensification in these particular places. So we've excluded the most marginal areas, and we've also excluded the most productive, famous examples of intensification processes, for instance, the Arusha region and areas that have been extensively studied before. And in statistical terms, the data set is representative at the village level. And there is a strong focus on staple crops. And the reason for this focus is that this, after all, will probably be the main key to feeding growing urban populations, will be the food question revolves around staple crops. And in this context, it's mainly maize, rice, sorghum, and we've also covered cassava and tuberous crops in earlier surveys. So who is the African smallholder? And this is just pulled out of the data set. What we know from this data is that, and this confirms roughly tendencies found in other literature, is that about 3/4 of these farms are managed by men, meaning that 1/4 of them are managed by women. On average, the average smallholder held 2.3 hectares of land, roughly. And the main crops grown are maize, which is grown almost universally within the sample, and what is known as other food crops. And this covers other tuberous crops as well as vegetables and beans and legumes. Out of the maize growers, 50% grow hybrid maize, and around 70%, just a little less than 70%, use inorganic fertilizer. And half of the maize growers sell maize. So half of them don't actually sell any maize. But the amounts sold are small. So the median amount is about 0.5 ton per household. And clearly this is a challenge if we are to feed growing cities. If farmers cannot feed themselves and cannot produce a surplus, how will they be able to feed people who are leaving agriculture and growing cities? And nearly a third of cash incomes is raised through sale of staple crops. So we have this sort of double dependence on the one hand of sort of external parties being dependent on commercialization, while the farmers themselves are very dependent on raising or selling staple crops to provide money, simply. So how has farming then changed since 2002? So what I just showed you were sort of a cross-sectional situation in 2013. Quite surprisingly, given the discussion about shrinking farm sizes, what we see is actually that on average farm sizes have increased. Not vastly, but they've increased from around 2 hectares to 2.3 hectares. There's a typo there. In all countries. More farmers are also growing maize, so there's perhaps not an increase of monocropping as such, but there's a tendency of moving towards maize. So from 83% to 93% between 2002 and 2013, while sorghum has dropped, which I think is interesting. I won't be saying very much about climate change because I think David spoke about that earlier, and also there are other presenters who will be talking about climate change. But it might be noted that sorghum is generally more drought resistant than maize, and still there's a tendency towards moving towards maize. And interestingly also what we see is actually production increase for both maize and rice, which is quite dramatic actually, from around 1 ton on average to 1.5 tons around that for both crops. But at the same time, what we see are also, so in some respect we can say, well, there is some sort of movement in the sense that production is increasing, farm sizes is increasing, but we don't actually see much of an intensification for maize. There's an intensification for rice, but not for maize. So it means that people are producing more simply because they're growing larger plots. And at the same time, we see signs of polarization and growing polarization. So maize production is highly differentiated by village, varying from around 150 kilograms to nearly 6 tons, depending on which village you're looking at. And of course, this is related also to production systems and cropping systems. But it goes to show that it's difficult to portray sort of the dynamics of the smallholder sector simply through one crop. At the same time, production is also greatly differentiated within the villages. So there's a persistent yield gap between those 5% of the smallholders that produce at the highest yield level and the rest of around 60%. And that has been unchanged since 2002. So while farmers are growing more, they're not growing, their productivity isn't really improving. And at the same time, land inequality has increased greatly in 4 of the 5 countries. And this is actually quite dramatic if we look at the Gini indices. The Gini index basically shows the distribution of an asset, in this case land. You can have them for incomes as well. So a Gini index of 1 is total inequality. One person owns everything. That's the basics. But it's also, and here we can see that the Gini indices, especially in the case of Tanzania and Zambia, and now we're talking about within the smallholder sector. So this is within our sample. It's not even in the country as a whole. But the Gini indices have actually increased quite remarkably for Tanzania and Zambia. And in the case of Zambia, this is probably tied to a deliberate policy of promoting a middle segment and promoting a larger scale sort of smallholder agriculture, which is I think problematic for many reasons. But so we see growing polarization in the access to productive assets, and at the same time, if we sort of look at processes over time, what's going on is also what we can see especially when we compare the period 2002 to 2008, is that we sort of get the picture of two dynamic types of production systems. Dynamic in the sense that they're growing and more food is being produced. And one is tied to mixed farming, grain focused, and it's extensive in the sense that it combines livestock with quite large scale land where primarily maize and livestock and to some extent cotton are combined. And on the other hand, the second system would be intensive high-value crops grown near urban markets. So perhaps not directly peri-urban agriculture, but still high-value crops such as fruits and vegetables and horticultural goods, and to some extent traditional cash crops, coffee and tea, grown quite close to urban markets or well-connected areas. And if we look at this aspect of pro-poor agrarian growth in the sense of agricultural growth that's driven by the market, but that also improves general livelihood prospects for most people, if that's how we choose to define pro-poor agricultural growth, it's very, very strongly concentrated to particular villages. And these villages are sort of being pulled out of poverty if we look at indicators such as food security access, cash incomes. We don't have data for, we haven't analyzed that data yet, but for like the basic indicators of food security access and improvements in living standards, it's extremely concentrated to particular villages in particular places. So in that sense, what we see is spatial as well as internal polarization, where the connection to markets is very crucial in this type of polarization. And the opposite process is occurring in the most marginal areas, where what we see is actually a retreat into subsistence. And I was quite stunned by the withdrawal from technology use, for instance, the shrinking of household sizes indicating out-migration rather than sort of a stable farming population. So it's sort of a two-way polarization going on. And what this means, now I come to the question of, well, so what does this imply for policy? What does it imply for strategy? And I realize that one of the privileges of academics is that we don't really have to have an answer to this. We can just say, well, this is what it looks like. But I venture an answer, and one would be that, well, we have different types of areas. If we return to the issue of the two production systems, we have well-connected, dynamic, intensive agricultural areas quite close to urban centers, where extension and education to meet increasingly exacting global standards of production, both for local markets as well as for global value chains, might be the way forward, in combination with market coordination and irrigation. To sort of those would be relevant ways of improving those areas further and sort of enhancing their productivity. In the grain-based mixed farming systems that combine grains with livestock, there needs to be technology that focuses on rain-fed agriculture mainly, and perhaps broadening of commercial opportunities outside grains, a focus also on small stock and livestock, with veterinary interventions, for instance, improving the health of small stock especially, and focusing on the gendered aspects of livestock, and things like microcredit schemes that may run outside agriculture. And finally, in the marginal areas, food security must be prioritized. There's little scope for commercialization. There's scope, however, for cash transfers and social policies, and health and education improvements may be actually more important than trying to boost agricultural productivity, because these people are very, very poor. Yes.
Thanks a lot. When you looked at the research, I mean, what you presented was interesting in terms of looking at farms becoming increasingly a bit larger. You mentioned also, for instance, that income distribution, you saw a negative trend there, for instance. Is this an example where we have potentially goal conflicts? We need to increase farm size to allow for investments, to make it easier for people to live on their farm, but at the same time we then make people more marginalized, those that do not have access. Is this an example of this complex goal conflicts that we may have if we don't do it correctly?
I think it's a question of geographical scale, because what I've shown you here is the Gini indices for the country as a whole, or not for the country, for the smallholder sector within the country. I think the interesting, I mean, there are different processes. One might be where you have villages or particular places in general where it's possible to extend land. So more or less everyone can extend their land, but there may also be internal processes of polarization. So I can't answer that question. Well, theoretically there's always goal conflict, but I think it depends on the local institutions and how they interplay with regional policies or national policies to give an answer to that. I know that in the case of Zambia, for instance, which I mentioned earlier, there is a deliberate policy to encourage sort of the mid-level of agriculture, exactly for the reason that you were mentioning, because of this perception that some investments are easier to carry through and it's possible to have more advanced technologies. For instance, Ghana has a similar scheme of like homegrown entrepreneurial farms. But we haven't had time to look at the data closely enough. I know those policies have been very criticized. I think they're very problematic. I've looked at the Zambian cases, and what we see is hugely growing polarization. So it sort of encourages the further marginalization of the most marginal elements. So there is, yes, in those cases, yes, there are goal conflicts. Okay,
excellent. I'm sure we're getting back to it. It's very interesting to see there is no sort of blueprint solution. You really need to be adapting to the conditions that you have, and they are very different in different areas. So I'm sure a lot of questions will come back about this in the panel as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And a warm applause again.